Good morning, everybody. I'm Evan Medeiros, the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Welcome to today's webinar, Xi's China and the Narrowing of People-to-People Contacts. Today's webinar is the second in a three-part series looking at the changing context of the US-China relationship, the emergence of strategic competition, and how it has impacted one of the most long-standing pillars of the relationship, which is contacts between people to people. Today's panel of experts is going to explore how leadership changes have altered approaches to people-to-people diplomacy and their interactions across art, education, and business. The first part in the series looked at history. Today's looks at the current context. And in a month, on December 8th, we're going to host the third and final part in this series that looks at the future of people-to-people ties under the changing context of the US-China relationship. For today's panel, I'm very, very excited to have four wonderful experts from across the different dimensions of the US-China relationship, all bona fide China watchers, to talk about the current context for people-to-people ties. Before I introduce them, I want to highlight that today's webinar is a joint effort between Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service and the US-China Dialogue. So I want to thank Mike Green and Tom Banchoff, my colleagues here at Georgetown, for helping sponsor this effort. And this is part of our collective endeavor at Georgetown to make sure that there continues to be a very active conversation about China and the US-China relationship and how it's changing in all of its dimension and its implications for different parts of US society. So I'd like to begin by introducing our wonderful panel for today. I'm going to do that in alphabetical order. First, we have Anna Ashton, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the US-China Business Council, which she joined in January of 2016. Anna has had a wonderful career that spans the Defense Department, the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. So Anna, as a representative of the U.S.-China Business Council, is going to share with us her views on how the current context under Xi is affecting the business community and business-to-business ties between the U.S. and China. Second, we have Allison Friedman, who's the James and Susan Moser Executive and Artistic Director for Carolina Performing Arts at UNC Chapel Hill. Prior to that, Allison was Artistic Director of Performing Arts for the West Kowloon Cultural District in Hong Kong, which sounds like a really fun, interesting job. And then previously, when I first met Allison, she ran, I believe she founded and ran Ping Pong Productions, a US and Beijing registered cultural exchange organization that works in more than 50 countries and on 5 continents. Third, we have Mary Gallagher, who's the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Professor of Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights at the University of Michigan, where she also directs the International Institute. Previously, for over a decade, she directed the Ken Lieberthal and Richard Rogel Center for Chinese Studies at Michigan. Mary's most recent book is called Authoritarian Legality in China: Law, Workers, and the State, which she published in 2017. And fourth, we have Carl Minser, who is a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor of law at Fordham University. He is an expert in Chinese law and governance, and he is the recent author of a wonderful book that I highly recommend to all of our listeners today called End of an Era: How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. And Carl's book is fantastic because it does exactly what we want to do initially today, which is paint the landscape for how politics and state-society relations have changed in China under Xi Jinping. So what we're going to do is open with presentations by all 4 speakers. We're going to go back and forth with some exchange, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. And I believe the way we do Q&A is for you to drop questions into the chat function. And I believe that's the way we do it. Drop them in the chat function, and then we will sort of pick and choose. Or no, I'm sorry, not the chat function. We have a Q&A function on this webinar. So drop them in the Q&A function, and then I will gather them up. And so we're going to talk with the panelists for about an hour or so, and then have about 30, maybe 40 minutes of Q&A. So with that, I'd like to open by asking Carl to spend about 8, maybe 10 minutes sort of painting the landscape for us. Carl, how has Xi Jinping changed Chinese politics and state-society relations, sort of the milieu for people-to-people ties? So over to you, Carl.
Great. Well, thank you, Evan. And it's an honor to be on the same panel with Anna, Allison, and Mary. And for those of us of a certain generation, we remember Sino-US ties of the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s as not just a question of military or diplomatic links, but also of a host of more ordinary person-to-person relationships involving Americans and Chinese that brought the two societies closer together. Take my own experience. In Kunming in the mid-1990s, I was a student. I was teaching in Xi'an in the early 2000s through a program sponsored by Yale in China. I participated in regular professional conferences going back to the early 2000s as an academic. And over this entire period, this is when I was running into people and organizations in China, everything from random foreigners and Chinese who were starting micro group hubs and tutoring groups in Beijing, to small domestic Chinese environmental and legal reform organizations promoting change at the grassroots, to large-scale interactions between the US and China run by organizations such as the Ford Foundation or Teach for China. The existence of all those interactions from the 1980s to the early 2000s were the artifact of two key post-1978 reform-era political decisions that were taken by Chinese authorities themselves. The first was Beijing's decision to back away from Maoist efforts at total political domination of society. After 1978, Chinese authorities fundamentally took a step back from attempting to control everything, contenting themselves instead with controlling the commanding heights of politics. In practice, this meant that there now started to be a range of space in society and culture and academics and economics that this, not at the top, but within each of these fields, that the authorities just didn't care that much about. And during this period, that opened the door for different actors in Chinese society to pursue their own interests, whether profit-oriented, idealistic, or purely aesthetic. The second decision was Beijing's post-1978 reform-era decision to view foreign models and foreign interactions as useful, particularly in the pursuit of national self-strengthening. This, too, was in contrast to the Maoist emphasis on autarkic self-sufficiency and suspicion of all things foreign that dominated in the 1960s and 70s. And this decision, in post-1978, opened the door to a more positive official attitude, whether official, formally expressed, or tacit, with regard to foreign interactions. Now, both of those political decisions have been fundamentally reversed. This, of course, isn't solely the result of Xi's policies since 2012. Sensitivity to Sino-foreign civil society exchanges and legal reform efforts, for example, started ramping up after the so-called color revolutions in Eastern Europe from 2003 to 2005, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. But things have particularly escalated since 2012 with Xi's rise. First, Xi once again seeks to make the party dominant everywhere. 东西南北中党是要领导一切的. And that means that party power is being reasserted in a whole range of fields that might have previously been regarded as more marginal. That's behind the tightening of controls in fields such as art, culture, and entertainment. It's also why corporate actors who might have once thought that they could hold politics at somewhat of an arm's length, satisfying party demands for political obedience through establishing relatively innocuous party committees and in their firms and making occasionally pro forma recitation of essential slogans, are now finding, to their surprise, increasingly stiff demands to tightly align corporate policies with central demands and grant party committees serious power in internal decision-making. The second political shift is that there's now a much more stronger increasing fear of foreign influence. This ranges from everything from a fear of foreign economic influence in the tech sector to the concern that gender norms from South Korean boy bands or Western LGBT discourse are contributing to the weakening of Chinese society and masculinity. And this is fusing with Xi's push to ground the party ideologically in China's own history and tradition. This is now producing a nativist swing within Chinese political discourse, which is seeping, of course, into policy decisions in society, where foreign ties and influences, once regarded 15 or 20 years ago as a positive mark of cultural cosmopolitanism, to become now regarded as suspect. And the cumulative effect of these two political shifts is that a whole range of Sino-US ties are starting to fracture one after another. Naturally, it's the large organizational ties that have gone first, the major civil society interactions, the foreign funding, the news organizations, and so on. Some of that is top-down pressure from state organs within China itself. But my sense is that there's also suspicion within China steadily creeping up from the bottom. There's an increasing sense of self-censorship and fear that makes ordinary people in China just increasingly rethink that desirability of the interaction with the foreign academic or the foreign journalist, because you just don't know what tomorrow might hold and what that interaction might become regarded as later down. Now, the next question is, how much further could this go? And I hate to be pessimistic, but I do think we're far closer to the beginning of this process than the end. I think there's a cold political logic in the way that things are developing. If you ask me to be brutally frank, I think you could easily lose all remaining organizational and educational ties within the near future, not just branches of Western schools in China, but perhaps even Chinese student flows overseas. And the real question in my mind is how much of the other person-to-person ties, tourism, family business, ordinary business exchanges could start breaking down as well. And just by way of reference, my mental rubric is the last time we had the same alignment of political factors that we're seeing now. Absolute insistence on party leadership everywhere, extreme sensitivity to foreign influence, and probably by the end of the party plenum, Xi Jinping thought baked into the party's core ideological framework. The last time we saw that sort of alignment of factors was the Maoist era. And in fact, that was the period where you did lose most of these other ties. And I think the real operative question might be, will the China of the 2020s and 2030s look perhaps more like the 1950s, where it lost Western ties, but still tried to cultivate relations with a host of other countries in developing countries and the Soviet bloc? Or will it look more like the 1960s and 70s, where it pretty much did sever itself off from almost everyone save Albania? Now, I completely understand the logical objections to this line of analysis, that moving in this direction would require Beijing to sacrifice the interests of regime supporters in the urban middle class who are interested in getting their kids overseas and a host of other foreign interactions. And doing so would also harm Beijing's own interests in cultivating foreign relationships and building soft power overseas. But the real problem for me is, I think if the current ideological and political trends in China continue, I'm not sure those considerations hold. You're already seeing party leaders shut down the entire tutoring industry aimed at prepping kids for college entrance exams because they worry about an escalating educational arms race, depressing fertility rates. You're seeing them start to go after the mega titans in corporate China because they worry about excessive wealth. And you're seeing them try to basically purge foreign influences from even relatively marginal corners of Chinese society. I see all of that, and I kind of think that Beijing is starting to view key aspects of the reform era itself as problematic, and turning those sectors of the society that, and turning against those sectors of society that themselves were the beneficiaries and products of the reform era. And increasingly, I worry that Beijing doesn't necessarily care about the ramifications of these trends inside or outside China. And I do worry that if that's the case, we could have a very dark road in front of us in terms of the trajectory of Sino-US relations. Naturally, that's only talking about political developments in China. There's a lot to say about what's going on in the United States as well, but I'll hold off on that now, and we can talk more about that in the question and answer section.
Carl, great. That's really interesting. Very, very sobering. So let me ask you a couple follow-up points just to sort of further understand your view. So as we all know, the CCP has always been very focused on control, and it's always had a sort of ideological Marxist-Leninist agenda. One could recall the campaign against bourgeois liberalization in the mid-1980s. So sort of what is different now? right? I mean, the instincts of a Leninist party are toward political control and societal control. So what is different now? And realistically, how far can Xi Jinping go when you have a China, that has spent 40 years under reform and opening and is deeply connected, at many levels of society with the international community, not the least its economy. So, evoking images of China in the 50s or 60s, it sounds a little extreme.
So that's, I'll put there, I think that I'll take those in order. So I think there are two key differences, or two shifts. The first is, you're correct that there's always been an insistence in the Leninist one-party state on control, but the level of control that's desirable varies at time. During the Maoist era, there was an insistence on sort of total control. During the 80s and 90s, there was a sense that we need political control, but this party took a half step back from attempting to dominate society. They didn't really care at certain levels what was going on in certain classrooms, in certain artistic spheres. There was really, that step back opened up a degree of space that people could move forward with. Same in the corporate world as well. The second difference, and this is an ideological shift that I'm picking up on, is recognize that there's the campaign against bourgeois liberalism. That's a period in the 80s when the nominal ideological framework for China is still Marxism, which is, of course, it's relatively empty political stuff, and it's in fact a Western import. The big shift that's starting to happen.
We all love to point that out to our Chinese friends, yeah, right? It's totally. A German philosopher that's driving their political thought.
The big shift to watch under Xi Jinping is the whole 优秀传统文化, the traditional Chinese culture is gradually being elevated. So China, under Xi Jinping, ideologically, China's starting to pivot to the past, its own past, as a shield against foreign influence. It's not like Marxism's automatically going away, but gradually you're seeing, the way I said, imperial hues of China are being reasserted. And that's precisely because they're worried about foreign ideological infiltration. And what that means in a range of other spheres is that there's an idea that maybe in law, maybe in culture, you don't need to look abroad. It's not politically correct to be looking abroad. It's politically correct to be looking inside China. And of course, China's got its own tradition, and it's a great thing to study. And but of course, this is a politically correct narrative, which is also being erected as a way to tell people, don't go looking there. And I think as you walk down that ideological path, that will start making foreign stuff increasingly suspect, or at least limited.
So, Carl, this sounds a little bit like the sort of modern version of the old Tiyong debate, right? You know the debate I'm talking about, yeah, sort of, absolutely. Chinese using Chinese aspects, in one dimension, right, Western aspects in another. Is that what's going on? It's just under Xi Jinping, sort of China is rich and powerful enough now that Chinese should rely more on sort of Chinese thought and Chinese experience as opposed to Western? Is that what's going on? Sort of a recalibration of the old Tiyong debate?
I think there's an element of that, but I also think it's also just important to realize that it's a if you really get into the ideological side, I think one, it's just a shield. It's like you have to come up with a reason why it's not important to sort of study foreign stuff. Because those are the foreign concepts that come in, whether it's gender discourse, whether it's other, and you want to create something that you are creating is authentically Chinese, but it's entirely created to prevent that stuff from coming in. I do think the other problem they've got with Marxism is revolution. I mean, I think you really start looking at Marxism, that's a revolutionary discourse, and you don't want that. So I honestly think that part of this is also neutering the revolutionary aspect of Marxism and sort of turning, China back into, we've got, authoritarian one-party rule. This isn't our heritage. All that stuff about organizing the bourgeoisie and the migrants. That's not what we want now. I'll stop.
So one last question for you, Carl, and I want to bring in. I'm going to go to Mary and bring in the others. Is the discussion we're having sort of about the trajectory of China is a very top-down one. This is what she wants. This is the party. This is what it's going to do to society. How should we think about this sort of in a bottom-up way? Because as you point out, there's a depending on what metric you use, a pretty large middle class, at least 300 million people, right? The entire population of the United States at a minimum is a middle class, a middle class that has benefited enormously from the reform and opening period, right? Who have lots of international ties, right? Chinese travel abroad a lot. And, to be very frank, the social contract, if you can call it that in China, has been, don't question political thought and the authority and legitimacy of the leadership as long as your life continues to get better. And if Xi Jinping starts saying like, hey, I'm going to paternalistically tell you how much time you can spend on video games, whether you can do tutoring or not, what apps you can put on your phone, right? I would imagine from a bottom-up sort of perspective of the life of a middle-class Chinese, this starts to feel a little onerous and the social contract doesn't feel comfortable. How should we think about that, sort of the bottom-up aspect of this?
Yes, I mean, I think you're pointing to a very real question that as Xi is beginning to sort of turn politically, he's beginning to sort of get the party involved in more private decisions that people thought previously. And I do think that is that's going to be the question of how ordinary Chinese people respond to that is going to be big. The dynamic, though, I think many people like to think that, like, well, just because Xi Jinping is doing some of these things and this is going to anger middle-class beneficiaries of the last 30 or 40 years, and he can't do this because it's unpopular. I think it's also important to realize how many different sides to China there are. That urban middle class is only one component of it. And if you turn against those foreign ties, if you turn against those people who are able to send their kids overseas, sure, that may be unpopular to certain groups of people, but there are other groups of people in Chinese society who have been left behind. And when you see your top leader begin to sort of do something that's, contrary to the interests of the people who you think have been looking down at you in some ways, that can be positive. It can be viewed positively by some.
Sounds populist. Like, you're talking sort of about a populist dimension to Chinese politics.
That is interesting. If certainly anybody's lived through the Trump era, you start to think, well, actually, some of these things.
I think we all lived through the Trump era.
I was in Taiwan for 2 years, so I unfortunately missed out on the last 2 years. But that's the dynamic that I think that people should be thinking about when I'll stop there.
One second here, Carl. And how does COVID sort of affect all of this? Is COVID an accelerant, sort of facilitating Xi Jinping sort of taking off with this agenda?
So I certainly think that this is where you can use that as a demonstration of like, look, yes, I'm tightening control over things, but you're not having the same problems that other countries experienced in terms of mass death, but then specifically the cutting off of ties with the travel restrictions. I'm interested whether that turns into something more long term, because that's really where you are starting to see an interruption. Shenyang, I think, is now it's a month quarantine before you get back, and I wonder. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it's just health related, but does this gradually morph into something else over time?
Right. So I want to turn to Mary Gallagher, and we asked Mary to talk about how this changing political and social environment is affecting educational exchanges. But before we get there, Mary, I'd love to get your reactions to Carl, right? I mean, like me, you've been studying Chinese politics your entire career. Carl's picture is a fairly dark one for both the current state and the future trajectory of the relationship. So do you agree with that assessment? Sort of how do you see it, maybe before you get into the implications for educational exchanges?
Thanks, Evan. I guess I don't disagree with Carl's analysis. And in fact, some of the things that he said, I should just, mark out from mine because we're just repeating each other. I do think that one thing we really don't properly take into account right now is the level of resistance within society regarding Xi Jinping's move. And, his moves in this kind of more nativist, populist, but more closed direction. So one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit in my remarks is what are the effects on the Chinese middle class and Chinese parents and students when Chinese society becomes more closed, the educational sector is becoming more controlled. what is that going to do to their choice when they think about where should my kid study? And I think it's not clear to me that he has people in agreement. I think we've seen huge pushback in the last month or so on these educational policies because, yeah, people in theory agree that we should reduce inequality. But when it comes to my own kid, no, I want the best for my own kid and I'll pay for it.
Interesting. Interesting.
So, the first thing I wanted to say about the topic, people-to-people exchange, is really to emphasize how people-to-people exchange between the United States and China has always been fraught and difficult. And that's really because most of these exchanges are not really exchanges between people to people, but rather between people and a party-dominated organization in China. And that's always been the case for universities. For me, studying labor, it's almost always been the case with trade unions or with lawyer groups, and for the most part, even civil society. There have been brief periods when civil society groups have been less tethered to the state in China. But for the most part, since the opening in the 1970s, we've had this weird imbalance where the United States groups are going there truly in a non-governmental way, but they're often interacting with an official organization. And this was made really clear to me when I was reading the account of Ping Pong Diplomacy by Ruth Eckstein, who was the wife of Alex Eckstein. At the time, he was a professor at the University of Michigan, and he was also the president of the National Committee on US-China Relations. She wrote this essay in 1993, and she makes this point sort of offhandedly, is that we were the US Ping Pong Association. We were self-funded, we were a small group, and then we had to host this major kind of diplomatic event. And the essay itself is quite hilarious. It talks about the rats that were thrown down by a right-wing group in Cobo Hall in Detroit with little paper parachutes attached to them onto the stage as the Chinese players were about to play.
They talk literally about rats, Mary?
Yes, dead rats. Dead rats with little paper parachutes, which I really liked as a detail.
Interesting. Mary, if you have a chance when you finish, if you could, you probably have a link to that essay, if you drop it into chat, because I think a lot of us, I know, sure, I would love to read it, but please.
Okay, I will. There's an account of getting ready to play a ping pong match, and they can't find the national anthem for China because it's in a player's suitcase. So they have to sort of figure out what to do. And most tragically, an elementary school in suburban Detroit, which shows a banner to welcome the players, but unfortunately writes Republic of China and not People's Republic. So these types of—
when that happens. Yes. I hate when that happens.
Yes. So these diplomatic, mistakes that are mostly because these are not diplomats, right? These are ping pong players and some professors and an NGO. So this really kind of brought home to me this problem, but also, obviously that was in the 1970s. China was much more closed. China, as Carl was remarking, was just going through this major change and making these decisions about opening up. So things should have improved since then, and they certainly have, but history and progress, as we know, are not linear. So after these relaxations in the 80s, again, we saw more relaxation in the late 1990s and early 2000s. People-to-people exchanges have become much more fraught and more political. And like Carl said, this really began under Hu Jintao around 2005, color revolutions, then going into the Arab Spring, but really accelerated under Xi Jinping. And civil society organizations have much more oversight, companies have much more political intervention, and really both sides, both the China side and the United States, have become more obsessed with the fear of infiltration by the other. But a bright spot in people-to-people exchange in this relationship has long been education. And I realized as I was writing this that people-to-people exchange is also PPE when I shortened it in my notes, which I'm thinking a lot about PPE these days. the gold standard for truly non-governmental people-to-people exchange has been the presence of Chinese students at American universities, especially students enrolled in undergraduate and graduate degrees. Overwhelmingly, these students are self-financing, they are self-selecting into US higher education, or their parents are selecting into US education, and they often have long-term plans to stay and work in the United States, and many have plans to settle permanently in the United States. Right before COVID in 2019, the number of Chinese students in the US totaled about 370,000, slightly more undergraduates at this point than graduate students. And the same year, just as a comparison, 12,000 Americans went to China. Chinese students make up more than 1/3 of all international students in the United States, and they contribute over $15 billion to the American economy in educational service exports. In many states like Michigan, these service exports were the top first or second overall service exports with China. So there have been obviously economic benefits to having Chinese students, but more so I would emphasize the educational benefits of opening up to Chinese middle class and families, particularly undergraduates, because really these are the people who are engaging in people-to-people exchange. These are the people who are individually making the decision to come to the United States and engage with American society. Now, since for the last several years, really ramped up during the Trump administration, but clearly continued into the Biden administration, we've seen US government concerns over intellectual property theft, national security threats from Chinese students and scholars, what the FBI had called the American universities as the soft belly of the United States. And I think these concerns, while legitimate, have unfortunately failed to discriminate among the many different kinds of students and scholars and researchers from China. As a broad rule of thumb, we could say that the younger and the most junior students are the least worrisome. They're the most able to take advantage of US higher education. And they're really, like I said, the truest approximation of people-to-people exchange. We risk alienating these students, and more importantly, the parents of these students, with indiscriminate fear-mongering campaigns around Chinese students. By and large, the problems uncovered by the Department of Justice China Initiative have rarely been related to these Chinese undergraduate students, but rather at the other end of the spectrum, older postdocs, visiting scholars, research scientists, and short-term visitors, even though the vast majority of this latter group is also mostly here to study, research, and contribute to scientific inquiry and advance their careers. Of course, these concerns, these political concerns, which, like I said, are legitimate and the Biden administration has continued to investigate, are being combined with the rise of anti-Asian racism in the United States, and are really potentially reinforcing fears among these Chinese students and parents about whether or not the United States is still a welcoming place to go. And these students will go elsewhere, right? They'll go to Canada, they'll go to Australia, they'll go to the UK. Graduate education in STEM in the United States is overly dependent on foreign students. So unless the US educational system can produce more students interested in STEM, we should not shy away from attracting the best and the brightest from abroad. If we do, we risk losing these students to other countries and not just China. And so we should think about our own policies in terms of diminishing the real positive aspects of this kind of people-to-people exchange. I want to just mention as well these other risks that have been discussed around education and the large number of Chinese students on American campuses related to the presence of these students and organizations connected to these students on American campuses. And most especially the Chinese Student and Scholars Association and Confucius Institutes. Another thing that I think is also of concern, which is not really an organizational concern, but is still a concern in terms of kind of how Chinese students interact with American society, is the Wechat bubble that many Chinese students are in even when they are abroad.
What do you mean by that, Mary? What's the Wechat bubble?
The WeChat bubble is just that the way in which people interact on social media is very much dependent on their existing networks. And so, of course, for Chinese students coming from China to the United States, maintaining connection to family and friends at home is mainly done through apps like WeChat, but it also can continue into when they come abroad, and then they'll continue to use that as their main source of information, their main source of socializing.
Sort of self-isolating. So they'll come to University of Michigan as an undergrad, but sort of stay in a WeChat bubble with their Chinese friends. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but more broadly, that there are divisions even within students who may speak Chinese on US campuses. So students from other parts of Asia that also would use Chinese language, but but wouldn't engage in WeChat. So it also creates barriers even among students who might share the same language. But it certainly creates a barrier between Chinese students and the wider array of news and information that they could attain while they're here. I've written a fair amount about CSSAs and CIs, and I won't go deep into it right now because of time, but I do want to just say about this issue of political control or the fear of political infiltration on US campuses through these organizations, that generally speaking, those issues are manageable. They're much more manageable than, say, national security threats, which are, really the purview of the government. And if they're managed properly by universities, they can really provide Chinese students the best demonstration of why higher ed in the United States is superior to higher ed in China, still even now, although higher ed in China has improved a lot. But it takes work. It takes preparation. It takes attention to these students. Once they come on campus and have paid tuition, there needs to be more attention. And I think broadly, we should also recognize that Chinese students, particularly now, are overwhelmingly politically diverse. Right? They are not all pro-CCP. They're not all anti-CCP. They have diverse political opinions, and we should try to create an environment where they can really truly feel freely to speak about those political opinions, whether for or against their own government. Just 1 second on Americans studying in China. Obviously it's a very imbalanced situation, but there are very important reasons for that. But in particular for Americans,
how imbalanced, Mary? Just to give our listeners sort of a frame of reference.
So there were almost 400,000 Chinese students in the United States in 2019. There were at the same time about 12,000 American students in China. So, and the other big difference, of course, between Americans and China in terms of education is that Chinese students leave China to get degrees abroad, right? They are coming here for a long extended period of time. They're getting accredited degrees. Most Americans who go to China are going there for short-term language study, which is similar to what many of us probably did. So it's a big imbalance, not just in terms of the numbers, but also in terms of the depth of integration and the benefits that I think the United States gets. Americans studying China, this was already in decline before 2016 and before COVID. I think there are lots of reasons for why we see this decline. And it started at the undergraduate level. There are other reasons, I think, in the social sciences why study of China has potentially at least stagnated. It was accelerated by the Trump restrictions, the cancellation of Peace Corps and the cancellation of the Fulbrights to China and Taiwan, and also, of course, the worsening political environment in China. It's been decimated by COVID, right? Completely decimated. And what I worry, and this is directly related to what Carl was speaking about at the end of his remarks, is that this long shutdown in China, mostly due right now to the pandemic, is leading to, I think, a generational gap. We will have a generational shift in the number of PhD students in particular who study China. It's simply too risky to commit to studying a country that you don't know is going to be open in 2022 or 2023. I mean, PhD programs are 5 years. Right. So if you're thinking you're entering a PhD program right now, you're interested in China, maybe you already speak Chinese or are studying Chinese or it's your native language, this is a big risk. And then the other fear that I have is that once we return to some sort of, quote unquote normalcy and we can travel again to China, the political environment in China will have shifted so much that research will still be quite difficult.
Yeah, I want to drill down on that one for a second because, scholars, including yourself, Mary, have built a career on field research, right? Some of the surveys you've done on labor in China, are particularly notable. So, once we sort of get past COVID and we're traveling back to China again, how do you think about the prospects for access? And, are we going to go back to the days of, a lot American China scholars spending time in Taiwan as opposed to mainland China? How should we think about that?
I think we've already seen a slight shift back towards Taiwan, and this might have been related to COVID restrictions, Taiwan being somewhat more open than China is. But I think it's also this more broad shift about the political environment. I think there are real difficulties in doing particularly what field research, qualitative research, interviews. A lot of this will probably be will shift towards more quantitative, kind of more distant studies of China. That's already happening partly just because of the way in which social sciences have changed. But I think the fear that many of us have is that we lose the ability to sort of interpret that kind of data without a strong sense of, we haven't been there in a few years. We're not talking to anybody. A kind of like ground truth that you need when you're looking at numbers that have been collected, often distantly or through collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, surveys certainly are much easier to do in China because there's a whole, group of scholars. There's a private sector industry that does surveys, but actually interpreting them through interviews is different. Let me ask you one final question, Mary. As somebody that has spent their career going back and forth as a scholar, that works on sensitive issues, right? Labor rights in China are politically sensitive, especially in a tightening control environment. Do you, as a scholar, do you think you have to worry about your physical security when you go to China at all?
That's a good question. I think after the detention of the two Canadians, the two Michaels, as we call them, I think that created a greater sense of concern. My top concern is not my own physical safety. My top concern is the safety of my colleagues, collaborators, and informants. And I personally don't feel comfortable doing fieldwork in China at this point, even if COVID was not putting that barrier there already. I think it's a really important concern that we have an ethical responsibility to think about.
Yeah. Well, that suggests that sort of China studies in the United States as a discipline faces some real challenges going forward.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because this is a period of time where we really need to understand China more. But I fear that the environment for that is not going to improve even after COVID relaxes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks, Mary. I want to turn to Allison Friedman to talk about the cultural space, arts, entertainment, and how the changing political environment does or doesn't affect that particular piece. In our first session, Allison, that we looked at the history, we touched a bit on cultural dimensions, but really didn't dive into it. And, as somebody that focuses more on political security, foreign affairs, I have this impression that cultural dimensions, really aren't dramatically affected by the changes in politics. Artists can go back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there are some high-profile folks, Ai Weiwei being the obvious one, who takes his art and has a political agenda. But can you sort of explain to us the relationship between cultural and arts exchanges and politics in China, and how we should understand the trends that Carl and Mary outlined and what that means for arts and cultural exchange? Over to you, Allison.
Absolutely. Thank you, Evan, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. I am the optimistic voice on this panel. And optimism does not mean realism. I want to start by certainly acknowledging Jan Barris on your previous panel, who has been such an influence on people-to-people exchange in the cultural sphere. I stand on the shoulders of giants like Jan and Yang Meiqi and others.
I think we all do. We can all attest to the fact that Jan is great, and the Public Intellectuals program that she created that many of us have been a part of has really brought our community together. So thank you, Allison. It's a great point.
Tremendous. I also have the benefit of having just moved to North Carolina 2 months ago after 20 years living in China, 16 in Beijing and Shanghai, and 4 years in Hong Kong. And that is largely thanks to the Fulbright program. When I was a Fulbright in 2002, there were just about 9 Fulbright Americans going to China. And when Trump shut that program down by executive order 2 years ago, China was one of the largest hosts of Fulbrighters in both directions, Chinese Fulbrighters coming to the US, American Fulbrighters going to China. It was one of the largest programs. So it cannot be overstated the importance of programs like Fulbright and Peace Corps to people-to-people relations, and shutting that down has been a devastating impact. Therefore, I would like to posit that the title of this panel, She's China and the Narrowing of People-to-People Relations, is incomplete. As the representative of the arts, I think I can use the analogy, it takes 2 to tango. And I would posit it has to be She's China, Trump and Biden's America, and the narrowing of people-to-people relations. Because this chilling we're seeing in multiple spheres is as much about the changing environment here in the US as it is about China. And it's an incomplete conversation to only look at one side. Now, that said, I would like to return to the optimism and give a little bit of context for modern, and by modern, I'm looking at the past 20 years, so very recent history. A key moment in cultural exchange in the artistic sphere. So we're talking about dance, theater, music, opera, avant-garde, wacky stuff. One of the important moments was when Beijing got the Olympic bid in the summer of 2001. When that decision was made, there was this sense of opening up, of we need to get to know each other, because in the summer of 2008, we will be inviting the world to our front door. And you saw a huge rise in interest in China from all aspects, including the performing arts. You saw it a lot in Europe, actually. The number of China festivals in Europe started to it's not an understatement to say explode. And a lot of the artists they were interested in were not the big government troops. They were the independent sector, the more contemporary scene, which did exist. And I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between the government.
And Allison, can you tell us a little bit about, when you say arts, are we talking about theater? Are we talking about,
Which genres?
painting,
Yeah.
music, sort of, what's the sort of full taxonomy of artistic exchanges between both sides?
So I will focus primarily on performing arts, dance, theater, music, opera. But what has happened is a blossoming in all aspects, including the visual arts, painting, calligraphy, the growth of traditional art forms. So the interest, I think one of the biggest shifts you saw in the last 20 years was a growing awareness outside of China that it wasn't just about Chinese opera and calligraphy and martial arts, but there's actually a growing contemporary and avant-garde scene in China in many cities. And since you asked about that, I will jump to that aspect. When China started to disassemble the state-owned enterprises, it wasn't just coal mines and shoe factories, but it was also arts troupes. So in very much the Soviet model, there were national ballet troupes, orchestras, conservatories, and these were government funded, founded, and operated. But many of these, including as China started to build theaters, venues, actual physical buildings, there was an effort to get thee to the marketplace and to try to understand what it meant to be more market driven with a performing arts environment, and they looked at different models, including the National Endowment for the Arts. The US, unlike Europe, Israel, Australia, the UK, we do not have a Ministry of Culture. So our arts ecology in the US is very different than many other places, including China, which does have a Ministry of Culture. So as it was looking to privatize many sectors, the arts were part of that. And certainly in the film industry, which we won't focus on today because it's a much bigger topic, that investment in the film industry has been a big piece. So today I'm focused on dance, theater, music, of all genres, jazz, classical orchestras. So in this lead up to the Olympics, one bright spot was in 2005, Alicia Adams, the Vice President of International Programming at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., hosted a Festival of China. This was the largest celebration of Chinese culture, probably in American history. More than 900 artists from China came through the doors of the Kennedy Center in the one-month festival. And many ripple effects happened from that. Many organizations that had never performed in America before ended up getting tours, residencies at universities, collaborations with American artists. So that was an incredibly influential moment of bringing Chinese artists into the US. In terms of American artists going to China, as these venues started to be built to look at more commercial models, there was an increase in international performances of all kinds coming into China. Now, they were largely from Europe because Europe has ministries of culture that can pay for artists to travel abroad. The US, it's a private funding model. They need private philanthropy to make that happen. So you didn't see as many American troops traveling to China in the early 2000s, but that has slowly changed because of an increasing privatization and closer ties between institutions. Now, after the Olympics, another key moment in people-to-people exchange in the performing arts was this priority that was a top-down priority in China, 走出去, going out policy. And it was part of their 软实力, the soft power efforts of China to build its image as a world superpower, not only in economics, but in the cultural realm as well. And when this going out policy started, it was a little clunky. It was government troops renting out a venue at Lincoln Center, giving away all the tickets for free, and then going back and reporting to senior officials that they had checked the box of going out. But no one locally in America saw the shows, and the actual meaningful people-to-people connection wasn't happening. That changed. What you saw were a lot of officials at local consulates and embassies paying attention to what the local interests were. And one example was my previous company you mentioned, Ping Pong Productions. We worked with Lincoln Center Festival in 2012, and Lincoln Center Festival invited a young, emerging contemporary dance troupe called Tao Dance Theater to come perform in their festival. The government was not involved at all. This was a festival looking around the world as they do to find the best arts. And we introduced Tao Dance Theater. They recognized the talent of this company and they invited them. When those people-to-people activities started happening, the government sat up and said, oh, here's an artist we would never have crossed our radar, but clearly there's resonance in venues in institutions like Lincoln Center, whom we respect. Maybe we should pay attention and support this. So you saw a lot of government support for international arts exchange start to be more about facilitating, not imposing. And they worked with organizations like the Edinburgh International Festival and other major arts festivals around the world to say, what artists are you interested in and how can we help get them from China to your stages? So there was a real growth in sophistication for these people-to-people exchanges that were about listening to what local economies and sectors were interested in as that evolved. And some of this also coincided with the privatization of the arts sector in China. So these venues are being built and you don't have government officials running them anymore. You need professional arts managers, you need producers, curators, people in the professional sector who know what it means to curate a season. You know, what do you do in these big, beautiful venues? You need art to put in them. And so at conferences like one of the biggest ones, the International Society of Performing Arts, ISPA, which is a New York-based NGO, but it's an international, they have members from countries worldwide. you started to see more and more arts managers from China seeing the value of these kinds of conferences, registering to come, not on official government delegations, but in their professional capacity as the head of the dance center in Shanghai or the head of the Chongqing theater troupe in Chongqing. So the professionalization of the theater sector in China saw growing ties with people-to-people exchange through these professional sector platforms in the US. Now I'm going to jump ahead to COVID because that's where we are today. And the impact of COVID on international exchange of all kinds has been devastating. It just was a guillotine because it cut all ties, and it has been devastating to artists and their incomes. It's been devastating to festivals and institutions, but it was certainly an external factor. Now that COVID is starting to creep away and theaters are reopening, although performance international travel is challenging, there has not been a decrease. What we're seeing now, and we're talking about within a matter of months, we're seeing a return to performances. So even as far back as June, there was a huge new venue in Shanghai that opened on the West Bund. And they invited American choreographers from New York who did the quarantine, got the visas, came over, worked with hundreds of dancers to do an installation in this venue on the Bund in Shanghai back in June. So American artists are being invited over, surviving the quarantine and engaging in these projects. You see nonprofit foundations like the Asian Cultural Council or the Yale China program, which provide grants for artists and arts professionals, arts managers to do residencies in each other's countries. These all stopped due to COVID because you couldn't do it, but they're starting up again. So new cohorts of grantees have been announced this past summer, and they start already this fall and in January coming into the US and going out. And anecdotally, there's been no decrease in the number of applications to these opportunities. So on that grassroots level, a very individual funding for international arts exchange.
So Allison,
yeah.
That's great. And it's always good to have a note of optimism. So, for example, when Xi Jinping adopted the NGO law, right, and you had civil society organizations in China, civil society groups focused on women's rights, legal rights, environmental rights, especially Western ones, or ones with, Western ones really had a hard time. Did the passage of the NGO law and the greater oversight on civil society, did that affect arts exchanges?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
Partially because in China, of the different entities you could register as an arts organization, there was not a very clear category of NGO for a registered entity. Most of it was in the cultural sphere or in kind of like an American version of an LLC. So the NGO law affected other industries far more drastically than arts and culture, especially in the exchange. It still allowed funding from NGOs abroad, like Asian Cultural Council or Yale China, to still be able to fund individual artists to go abroad. Another interesting point is in 2013, Xi and his government established the National Arts Fund. This National Arts Fund was in many ways modeled on our National Endowment for the Arts in the US, with one interesting difference. The National Arts Fund in China does fund individual artists, which the NEA does not, as a result of 1980s culture wars in the US, where one of the flashpoints was Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs, which some conservative members of Congress felt were pornography and not art. And as a result, the NEA stopped funding individuals. They would only fund institutions. In China's National Arts Fund, granted who can apply, there's still some very clear rhetoric about 正能量 and positive energy or red aspects. So there is still very...
And so is that National Arts Fund, though, is that sort of a mechanism of political influence and political control? The NEA, I would say is not that in the United States, but obviously our system is very, very different. So obviously the creation of a national arts fund, having those resources is good, but is it really just another way for Xi Jinping to sort of impose his view of state-society relations on the culture and the arts sphere?
When it was started, it was actually an effort to redirect funds that used to only go directly to established Guoyin Danwei, to official government troops, and to allow more privatized organizations to apply for funding directly. Who gets the funding obviously is going to impact who can then use that to make works. I would suggest that rather than the funding body, it's still the ongoing performance permit application is the way that things are vetted.
Mm-hmm.
And that has not changed. That's always been in place. The PUN, every performance, whether it's local or international, applies for a performance permit. And that involves submitting scripts, submitting translations of scripts, videos of works, biographies of artists, and it goes through a series of reviews, and then a performance permit is issued, which then allows visas to be applied, and then you can start promoting a performance. So that's the more structured vetting process for performances that exist in China. And that continues. There's certainly been no relaxing or tightening one way or the other than there's always an ebb and flow. Anybody who works in China knows the cycle of the calendar. If there's a certain big lianghui, a major meeting coming up, things will tighten a little bit. You might not promote a performance at that time. You might wait till a couple months after. And everybody kind of knows what those tides are in the annual cycle to follow.
Sure. And so as of today, sort of when we look at the art space between the United States and China, when it comes to visual arts, performing arts, where are the ties sort of strongest, and how do you think about the future?
I would echo what Mary talked about in these individual to institutional ties, because all of this exists in that interdependent web of government and private funding, institutions and individuals. I think that one bright spot 4 weeks ago, Tianjin Juilliard just signed another 5-year agreement to be able to have students from America and China studying classical music there in Tianjin and be conferred an American Juilliard degree, not a Chinese degree. Peking University is looking to launch a theater managers program and are inviting professionals from the US to help develop that program. So you're still seeing, and actually currently at the Olin Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing in July, they opened the most comprehensive exhibition of Andy Warhol ever to be in China to date. So you're seeing institutions launching programs right now that are continuing these ties in visual arts, performing arts, and arts education. And I think that those will continue. I think there's and this weekend actually in New York, the Chinese consulate, they can't bring in artists from China because of travel issues, but they're working with US and based Chinese and American artists to put on a performance at Lincoln Center this Saturday and again right before Thanksgiving weekend. So now that we're seeing COVID start to loosen its grip on the industry, I think we're starting to see things are going to fill that vessel from an institutional perspective, from a funding perspective, and even from a government exchange perspective.
Wonderful. Wow, that was fantastic. A real tour de force. Thank you, Allison. So we're going to turn to Anna Ashton, who's going to talk to us about business to business ties and how they've been affected by Xi Jinping and, of course, by COVID. Before we turn to Anna, though, I just want to remind listeners that in about 10 minutes, we're going to turn to Q&A, and that should give us about 20 minutes or so to answer your questions. And so the way to do it is to drop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I see we've already got a couple questions in there, but please do so, in advance. So type out your question right now, if you would. As Anna starts speaking, so we can, make sure that we, make this as interactive as possible. So again, drop it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to turn it over to Anna Ashton, Vice President from the U.S.-China Business Council, to talk about how business-to-business ties are changing or not under Xi Jinping. Anna?
Thanks, Evan. And I just want to provide a little bit of context. The U.S.-China Business Council is a trade association based in D.C. with offices in China, and we represent U.S. companies that do business in and with China. We have about 265 members, and a lot of them are major U.S. brands. When we talk about people-to-people engagement between the U.S. and China, I think we generally mean engagement via education, sports, tourism, culture, and the arts. And business engagement is thought of as more transactional and not necessarily considered a vehicle for improving mutual understanding. Much of the business engagement we see from our vantage point as a trade association is more like people to government or people to organization engagement. We do a lot of communicating to the Chinese government on behalf of the US business community, as well as communicating to the US government, raising the US business community's concerns and advocating for their interests. But on the ground in China, our member companies are steeped in people-to-people engagement. Many, in fact, most of their employees are Chinese nationals, and increasingly it is Chinese nationals running their China operations and reporting back to headquarters with advice on how to address issues in the China market. When US companies first entered the China market, they were largely there for cost-saving purposes, manufacturing in China and shipping goods back to the US and other developed country markets. While this involved employing Chinese workers in manufacturing facilities, the extent of US companies' engagement with these workers could be relatively limited. But China's middle class has now grown to more than double the size of the US population, and its consumer market is the second largest in the world, quickly catching up with the US and expected to surpass us in the near future. Chinese customers are therefore a central factor these days in people-to-people ties for the business community, and they're driving increasingly sophisticated understanding of Chinese people and culture within US companies that do business in China. That means US companies are increasingly focused on understanding Chinese consumers' preferences and branding and marketing with them in mind. And this too involves people-to-people engagement. Chinese demand for US services like tourism and education has been another important avenue for people-to-people engagement to flourish within business. Many people don't realize that the US tourism industry and dollars spent by foreign nationals on education programs here in the US constitute US exports. Tourists are a mainstay, or tourism is a mainstay of people-to-people engagement, and students studying here even more so, as we've discussed. I just wanted to run through a few statistics on this because I think people don't necessarily realize the extent to which both of these services sectors have benefited from increased Chinese consumption. So in 2011, just over 1 million Chinese tourists were visiting the US annually, and by 2017, that number had grown to nearly 3.2 million. During most of the Trump administration, even as the trade war raged and tension between our two countries intensified, these numbers remained high. About 3 million Chinese tourists visited the US in 2018 and 2.8 million in 2019. Some of the drop-off that we saw in those years was attributable to increased difficulty obtaining US visas. In 2013, the rejection rate for Chinese tourist visa applications was 8.5%. By 2018, it was double that at 17%. Even with these dips, though, China remained the third largest source of overseas tourists entering the US, and Chinese tourists accounted for 7.8% of all overseas travel to the US in 2018 alone. Only when COVID hit did we really see that number drop to just 378,000 Chinese tourists visiting the US in 2020. Chinese tourists also spend a lot more money than tourists from most other places, an average of $6,700 per person per trip, which is about 50% more than your typical international tourist. So US travel destinations all across the country, from Arizona to Boston, Miami, Colorado, have eagerly marketed to Chinese tourists, and tourism agencies, both private sector as well as government agencies that promote tourism, have increasingly targeted Chinese travelers over the past 10 years. And you see this play out in little ways that maybe escape most people's notice. But for example, I'm sure some of our audience shops at Sephora, and it was a few years ago that Sephora started offering the Alipay payment platform to customers here in the United States in Sephora shops. The education story is even more striking, and I won't linger too long on this point because Mary has already elaborated in detail, and and I don't think a whole lot more needs to be said, but before COVID, China was the largest source of foreign students studying at US universities, with 35% of the total international student population coming from China. And this accounted for something like $44 billion spent in 2019 by international students on US education services. But American attitudes towards China and tensions in the bilateral relationship, as well as visa restrictions, are putting pressure on the market for US education services for Chinese students. Even before COVID, we were seeing that an increasing proportion of Chinese students studying abroad were considering destinations like Canada, with a decreasing proportion looking at destinations like the United States. Chinese businesses have gone out and invested abroad, and that too has been a source of people-to-people engagement and increased understanding. But this wave of outbound investment has not met its potential, I don't think, for improving understanding between our people.
Can I ask you about that? Because
please.
Outward FDI by China certainly is on a global level is a notable trend. But of course, we're talking about US-China today. And Chinese FDI in the United States has actually dropped off pretty dramatically in recent years. I believe the Rhodium Group has done some studies that suggest that, while America debates whether it should decouple from China, it looks like Chinese investors, and here I'm talking about private sector investors, have basically decided America is not a place they want to invest anymore. Is that your understanding as well? And how should we think about that piece of it?
Yeah, I mean, so the Rhodium Group really is a great source of data for looking at trends here. And I think that part of the reason that there's been a decline and there's been a precipitous one is maybe Chinese investors deciding that they prefer to do business elsewhere. But there's also, Beijing is also driving that precipitous decline. In 2017, Beijing started putting in place a lot more restrictions on outbound foreign direct investment.
Some but of not that specifically related to the U.S. Just generally, they didn't.
Generally, right. Yeah. It wasn't U.S. targeted, but it certainly reduced the amount of FDI flowing from China into the U.S.
Yeah.
But even when that FDI was increasing, and it increased dramatically. So in 2010, Rhodium Group says that there was 6.1 billion worth of Chinese inbound foreign direct investment in the U.S. and then by 2016, it was 48.5 billion that year. So it was really booming. But even at its height, only 10% of that investment was greenfield investment. So opening new facilities and creating brand new opportunities for employment. 90% was mergers and acquisitions. And I think that matters because greenfield investment is far more visible in local communities, and it's a more powerful tool for engendering positive attitudes toward the origin countries involved, as well as interest in understanding them.
So Anna, I want to get to Q&A, but I do want to ask you about the other side of the equation. You did a lot on sort of Chinese views on the U.S. as an investment opportunity and what China's doing. How do American businesses look at China as an opportunity, right? Those of us that sort of look at sort of politics and geopolitics hear a lot about growing frustration from the business community, largely anecdotal, about a, unlevel playing field, inhospitable environment, right? Subsidies, industrial policy, right? The whole sort of litany.
Right.
From your perspective, how should we how do you think about the changing sentiments of U.S. businesses toward China under Xi?
So I think it was Allison made a really good point that the changing sentiments are not just about Xi Jinping's policies; they're also about U.S. policies. I mean, there are two sides here that are contributing to the overall trend, but certainly the trend is one of what we call it is moderating optimism. Still, China is an incredibly important market for our member companies. U.S. companies that do business in China see China as essential to their ability to be competitive globally, and that hasn't changed for the vast majority of our companies. 92% of them reported in our annual member survey this year that they were profitable last year. And 48% said that they're going to double their investment, or not double, sorry, they're going to increase their investment next year. And we don't really have a lot of companies reporting that they are moving operations out of China. And that's largely because of what I mentioned earlier, that more and more US companies that have business in China are in China for China. They're there to serve the China market. So even if there are restrictions on the US side, that doesn't necessarily translate to them wanting to move their operations or needing to move their operations out of China, because serving the China market is facilitated by being there. That being said, US-China political tensions have been the #1 risk and concern that our companies have listed in the last 4 years running when asked to rank their top 10 challenges doing business in China. And that wasn't even in the top 10 before 2018. And that continues to be the trajectory. And certainly we're seeing under Xi Jinping, especially in the last few years, an increase in state support for Chinese companies, regulatory barriers that disproportionately affect foreign business, skew the playing field even more than was already the case. Things like dual circulation, the drive to increase self-reliance in China while seeking to maintain export markets. And some of this has been probably driven by mutual distrust and restrictions on business engagement in things like the high-tech sectors, which is as much a function of US policy probably as Chinese policy, but nonetheless, we are hearing increasing concerns from our companies, and we're also hearing them express reservations about the stability of the business environment and the predictability of the business environment.
Great. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left, so I want to go to the Q&A. We're going to start with a question for Allison. And the question, Allison, from one of our listeners today is that international performing arts may still be permitted in China as a purely decorative art like fashion design and painting. So the question is, what about narrative arts like drama, film, fiction that deal with conflict, politically sensitive issues, and tend toward political and cultural critiques? Isn't China's censorship of Chinese and international narrative arts pervasive and deepening? It seems like any art form that invites interpretations that are not purely emotional are in trouble. So that's for Allison. And then I've got a sort of series of questions that I think are sort of for Mary and Carl. And it's basically, a lot of this crackdown in both in China and the shrinking of space in US-China educational and other exchanges, you attribute largely to Xi, but isn't the Trump administration and the Biden policies that continue them, aren't they partly responsible for this shrinking of space in the US-China relationship? And so the question is sort of, really should we be laying this all at the feet of, of Xi Jinping? Is that fair? Or is the populist response in the United States under Trump, continued under Biden, also an important factor here? So let me first invite Allison to address that question and then move to Mary and Carl. So Allison, over to you.
Sure. Officially on the books, there are only 3 things actually illegal in performing arts in China: nudity on stage, self-mutilation, and explicit criticism of the party. And that's been in place for quite a while. Everything else is
that's quite an assortment, Allison, I have
yes.
to say. Nudity on stage, criticism of the party. I would have put those in the same basket.
Sometimes they go together. So as with many things with China, there are ebbs and flows of when there's more scrutiny and when there's less. And there's no doubt that we are in a period of greater scrutiny, both for within China artists operating there, as well as international artworks coming in. I would, given what I see coming to stages, examples like the Andy Warhol exhibit, certainly certain specific paintings aren't in that exhibit, but others are. And I think that there's a broad range of performance and abilities to express that are not simply entertainment or escapism. And to say that we're going into a purely entertainment escapist direction That's not where we're going right now. When we're looking at collaborations, even you could argue that Tianjin Juilliard, oh, everybody can play lovely classical music together, and that's quite innocuous. On the other hand, when we're talking about ensuring that these connections stay so that people are working together to develop these mutual understandings, if a Trojan horse of classical music is what we need, it's valuable, and it allows us to weather storms externally to get to the place where there might be back to that opening that we always see in this kind of accordion phase in China's long history.
So you basically, you don't really think so. You don't see a lot of censorship being applied to either visual or performing arts.
I don't see an increase. I see that the base maintenance is maintaining. In mainland China, film and television is always vetted far more closely than live performance because it reaches more audience. And so the body that vets film and television for China is a different body than who vets the permits for live performance. The number of performances being vetted, there's always an element of self-selection. People know what generally in the
so I was
tenor
going to
is
ask
going
about
to-
that. Is there some self-censorship in the arts community, Allison? You know, your colleagues that you work with, are they they understand, sort of what the boundaries of the permissible are?
I think not just in the arts community. I think even in my experience working with some of the funders know what the boundaries are. One example, we were bringing a theater director to a festival in Israel maybe about 8 years ago, and he's been known to be critical. He's worked a lot in Germany, but the particular production we were bringing to Israel was not one of his critical ones. And the conversations I had with our funders from the China side said, look, we want to support this artist because we know he's great and we know he's not going to embarrass us when he's over there. And it was this tacit understanding of how to support things. And he knew as well how to navigate that. I think in many fields, and certainly in the performing arts, is the phrase 上有政策,下有对策. We know what the official policies are here, and we know how to maneuver down here through that with the long view in mind.
Got it. Now, Carl, I see your hands up? Did you want to come in on this conversation, or which, of course, we would warmly welcome? Yeah. Okay.
I just had a quick question because I'm just honestly curious. So, Allison, you were running the West Kowloon Cultural District for the last 4 years. What did you see there? I mean, just because you were the eyes on the ground in terms of what you had been seeing. What did you see over those 4 years when you were running that? Because, yeah, I'm just curious. Anything you might say on that, if you can.
Anything specific or just generally?
Like, what was it like? Yeah, I mean, because you would have seen, this is a period, of course, when Hong Kong's going through certain shifts and things are happening. And of course, Hong Kong is having to respond to things that are coming out of Beijing. And so just, you came in 2017 and you left in the spring of 2021, right?
Allison, I think what he means is, was there, any changes in Zhengzi or Guizi?
Well, there was a very big change in Zhengzi with the national security law. The difference in Hong Kong being a very different place than mainland China is there isn't the history of 上有政策,下有对策. There is just rule of law and people follow it. So what we saw were, I would say, a flowering of discussions about what this will mean and how do we know what this will mean at which stage. So in the time I was there, we opened 2 theaters in 2019. And during that time, everything proceeded as planned. There were conversations about what will be possible moving forward and what won't. And again, how do we know? And that's always that how do we know is the big looming question, because rarely does someone tell you so directly, especially in the cultural sphere. There's a lot of guesswork. And in mainland, people who are brought up in that environment, in that temperature, they know how to read the temperature of the water. In Hong Kong, because it's such a shift, there isn't that instinctual understanding. And honestly, I don't think there exists an answer yet because everything is so new. So what's always, whereas I think in China, even though we're talking about an increase in certain things, it's still on a spectrum. Whereas with Hong Kong, we've seen in many ways what is a much greater turn of the given circumstances. And at this stage, I think everybody just is full of questions and no answers.
Mhm. Mary, I want to bring you into the conversation. You saw that we sort of had a question of, do we have the causality of this, right? This, the source of this. How should we think about sort of Chinese tightening versus sort of the U.S. response?
I would say I don't disagree with the notion that these things are coming from both sides. That's surely the case. And I do think that a lot of the moves during the Trump administration were particularly egregious, including most especially the cancellations of things like Fulbright and Peace Corps, because it diminishes our ability to understand and study China. But what is happening, I think it's important to remember that the tightening, because it's happening from both sides, is creating, I would imagine what is going on right now among Chinese parents and students whose kids are maybe in middle school or in high school, and they're thinking about, or even younger for that matter, because usually it's self-selection very, very early about whether your kid is going to study abroad or not. If the US continues to appear to be unwelcoming, either because of visa restrictions or because of anti-Asian racism or because of national security concerns, then we will really create this kind of long-term decline in the number of students coming here who can then understand American society. So I think it's, obviously it's on both sides, but we have an opportunity, much more than China does right now, to reverse the tightening and the closures. And I think we should do that as soon as possible.
And Mary, let me come in because we've got another question. It's really for the whole panel, so I welcome everybody to jump in here. That basically said, is the trend that we're witnessing on the part of China, is it really, sort of closing to the West, or is it just sort of redistributing away from doing less with the United States for the reasons you talked about and doing more with, Canada, the UK, Europe, Australia, maybe not Australia, but right, is that really what we're talking about here? Is that, China's not closing itself off to the West, but sort of redistributing how it thinks about people-to-people interactions. Carl, what do you think?
So I think there are a couple of different trends. So one, so just to reiterate, I definitely think that if you're talking about the broad spectrum of what's going on with U.S.-China relations, the tightening of the cutting of ties, yes, both countries are responsible for each of what they're doing in their own country. If you want to look at why you're not getting, visas in the United States, you got to look at Trump. But similarly, if you want to understand why negative trends, why, 2016 spring, the foreign NGO law was passed in China, that's not in response to Trump. Trump wasn't even elected at that point. That's direction, things that are happening inside China itself.
Sure.
Both countries bear responsibility, and both countries bear responsibility for what's happening in their own country. The question about sort of what happens in the long term, I think that's interesting. I think there is, as Allison mentioned, there's still interest in, particularly on official China, in encouraging stuff going out. And I do think that at least in the short term, there's still going to be interest in terms of having stuff going in. One area that I'm taking an interest in now, Africa and other, I do think that there's going to be, as China considers long-term strategy, there's, even if they get less comfortable with stuff flowing in from certain places, say the United States, China, if you look at African student numbers going, of course, pandemic creates, but it's a huge increase in African students coming into China at the same time as sort of foreign American students are really low. And I think so for the short term, I think there may be more of that. The interesting question in the longer terms is, does China start to have some of the same problems with other flows coming in? One thing for me on the Africa side is, evangelical groups, very active African evangelical groups. And I think it gets interesting at the point at which you start being like, well, wait a minute, the people who are conducting then you can just spin out some of the problems that like, hey, it's going to play out in a different area. So.
Anna, I want to bring you into this. To what extent do you see a sort of redistribution going on?
Right, I think this is an interesting question because I think there's plenty of data suggesting that this isn't US centric, that Chinese engagement with other Western countries has had its fair share of drama and turbulence in recent years. I think we all have seen that, but there's also data that shows that there's an imbalance when it comes to how much worse US-China ties have gotten versus China-Canada ties or China-Australia ties, et cetera. And I think, just a couple points to illustrate that. One is tariffs. So average Chinese tariffs on US exports over the last few years during the trade war went from 8% to 20.7%. And during that same period of time, average tariffs on exports from other countries into China went from 8% to 6.7%. So definitely there was, a favoring of exports from countries other than the US. Export controls. There's been a huge push in Washington to rethink export controls and tighten export controls on all sorts of products going to China. But if those products are available on the global market already from other sources, and we are restricting them unilaterally, then we're not actually preventing China or Chinese entities from getting those items. We're just ceding market share. And that is increasingly a problem for the US business community. And that does have implications for future US competitiveness. Some of our companies in sort of high-tech spaces say 80% of the profits that go into their R&D here in the US are directly tied to China. So how we can remain competitive vis-a-vis China if we lose such a major source of revenue that funds the R&D for that competitiveness is a big question.
Well, thank you so much, Anna Ashton, Allison Friedman, Mary Gallagher, Carl Minser. This has just been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I think the people-to-people relationship, remains an important pillar of the U.S.-China relationship, but it's obviously changing. It's very interesting that Fulbright and Peace Corps closed down. I think those are big, important questions before the Biden administration. That I think is could speak to how they view these interactions going forward. But I want to thank the four of you for spending 90 minutes with us today. And to remind our listeners that we're going to do the third and final one in our series on December 8th, looking at the future of people-to-people ties, sort of begin speculating about how the trends that we talked about today may play out in the years to come. So many thanks to all of you. Many thanks to all of our listeners. I see that Mary dropped Eckstein's article in the chat. So many thanks for that, Mary. I'm going to download that now. And I've got reading for this evening. And thanks to all of you and all of our listeners. And again, this is a joint production of Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service, the U.S.-China Dialogue. I want to thank my colleagues Eleanor Albert and Leanne Deckert for putting it together. And please join us on December 8th. Thank you.
Thank you.